Chapter 1. In the coming year of our Lord, the 1852 Farmer's Almanac predicted 4 eclipses, 3 of the moon, 1 of the sun. It said nothing of torrential rain, no prophecies of muddied fields or stalks of cotton so waterlogged and beaten down the bolls grazed the earth. By the time the hot Texas sun made its return, glaring its indiscriminate and wanton gaze, it was much too late. The cotton wouldn't mature, instead choosing to rot right there, the bolls refusing to open. It held back the white woolly heads that were so much in demand and instead relinquished a dank fungal smell that remained trapped in the air for weeks. The day we were ordered to clear the field, we prayed for a norther, those horrible howling winds that scared us plumb to death our first winter in this strange country. But we knew better. Texas weather was an animal all its own, and we had yet to figure out what gods it answered to. With no plow, we had no choice but to break it up by hand. We took to the field with pickaxes and dug up the roots, and patch by patch, we set them aflame. It was easy to get too close, to underestimate the direction and sway of the growing fire. We spent the day that way, leaping from one blaze or another, our long skirts gathered in our fists, while black plumes of smoke darkened the sky. The smoke remained long after dusk. It was still there late that night when we shook off sleep and stumbled out of our lumpy bedding to peek outside through the gaps in the cabin's chinking. All the while, we debated whether to go crossing at all. There was a lot of complaining and grumbling about tired limbs and feet, about bad air and threatening fog, about howling dogs, hungry lobos, and angry Hanks lying in wait. Yet, no one wanted to be left out. We yanked loose the rags and moss stuffed into the cracks and crevices, but even then, we couldn't see much. Everything appeared to be still and dark. Ahead, a haphazard row of sloping outbuildings stuck out of the ground like crooked teeth. The high, brilliant moon made monstrous shadows of them, dark shapes we stared at for long bouts until we were sure there was no movement. The wind stirred, and we could hear the wild swinging branches of half-dead trees just beyond the farm, the knobby limbs that clacked all night. We listened past them for dogs, for wolves, for any sign of the Lucys. Opposite the outbuildings was the Lucys' house, a wide double-pen cabin nearly 3 times the sizes of ours. From our doorway, only a sliver of their house was visible, but it was just enough to gauge their wakefulness by the solid black reflection of their window panes, the lack of firelight seeping from the cabin's walls. The Lucys did not like us moving about at night. Often, they threatened to lock us in after dark. We imagined only the fear of fire kept them from doing so. After all, burned-up property was akin to having no property at all. A quick word about the Lucys, if we must. To most, they were known as the Harlows, Mistress Lizzie and Master Charles of Liberty County, Georgia. Or really, she was of Liberty County, Georgia, and he was one of the many who came to the Texas countryside, claiming to have no past, in hopes of making the land yield some invisible fortune he believed he was owed. But to us, they were just the Lucys. Sometimes Miss or Mrs., Mr. or Master, but typically just Lucy, spawn of Lucifer, kin of the devil in the most wretched place most of us have ever known. One by one, we slipped out of the cabin and around the corner and farther still, past the Lucys' property line. There were 6 of us total, trudging single file into the forest. Junie led the way, followed by Patience, Lulu, Alice, and Sarah, while Nan, the eldest, brought up the rear. We slipped deeper into the grove of dead trees, the large oaks and elms skinned of their bark, in various stages of atrophy. This was believed to make clearing the land easier, but it seemed to us wholly unnatural, another sign that the land of the dead maybe didn't reside under the sea as we previously thought, but was somewhere nearby, in some neighboring county in Texas. When we became we, Texas country was still new, only a few years old in the Union. Navarro County was known as a land of wheat with dreams of cotton. Corn was the surer business, but men like Mr. Lucy came to Texas with cotton on the brain and dragged us along to make sure the land would yield. He had been unlucky before, we knew from Junie, because she had been with the Lucys the longest. She had worked for Mrs. Lucy before she was a Mrs., then was carried off to Wilkes County, Georgia, where she worked field after worn-out field as the couple's debt grew and grew. And she told us how they packed up and left in the dead of night to outwit angry creditors that threatened to seize what little he had left. By then, all Mr. Lucy had between him and sure ruin was 30 worthless acres and 3 slaves. They took to the road in 2 wagons stuffed to the gills with furniture, clothes, crockery, and seeds. The Lucys fighting all the while, their 2 small children screaming in fits. Harlow droned on about a vision from God, about a land of plenty, while his wife called him a fool with foolish ways, her pitch increasing with every mud hole, every windstorm, every feverish river of dirty water. God's favor would surely shine upon them, Harlow assured her. But when their 2 male slaves were seized and held at the trader's office in New Orleans for outstanding debts, Junie wondered if Lizzie was right all along. She knew she had only been spared a place in the trader's pen, because on paper, Junie belonged to Lizzie, a dower slave held in trust for Lizzie's children. Junie never told us much about the 2 men who had been seized, if they were kith or kin, and if that was the reason she didn't work in the house for Miss Lizzie anymore. Instead, she told us about the tavern in New Orleans where they stayed for a couple of nights. How she sat on the back steps outside the kitchen, eating a bowl of bland rice, while the men's voices, drinking and carousing inside, carried out into the alley. How she was listening for Harlow's voice, to hear how he might go about retrieving the 2 men and how long that might take. He was sitting at a table a few feet away from the door, downing beer with his Uncle Pap, a Louisiana merchant, and she wondered how long Pap would continue bragging before he offered to pay Harlow's debt. But that offer never came. Instead, Pap told him, start fresh, take what you have left and invest in women. They are cheaper than men and more versatile, can not only pull a plow and clear land, but can cook and clean too. And best of all, they can breed, increasing a master's profit year over year every time a child is born. But be careful, boy, about using your own seed, the man warned. Out there, you'll want hardier stock, and while half-breed gals fetch top dollar down here, outside Orleans, you can hardly get 2 nickels for 'em. At the markets in Louisiana, Harlow asked us all the same questions. Had we borne children before? How many? And had those children survived? In the back rooms of the auction houses, where they pulled dresses up to the neck, squeezed breasts, thumped hips, examined teeth, more questions were asked about the history of our wombs. Our previous owners, or the brokers that negotiated for them, were asked about our health. Were we without venereal disease or tumor? Were we verifiably sound, and would a doctor certify to that fact? Harlow was teased about his need for certification, while the rest of the planters assured him they could read a slave body like a book, could determine with their bleary eyes and grubby, calloused hands all one needed to know. Alice, Sarah, and Lulu were acquired there, along with Patience and her young son Silas. Nan, having been in Texas prior to the war with Mexico, was picked up in Houston. Too old to be a breeding woman, he was told, but a good cook and doctoring woman, which he figured he would need out in the wilds of the upcountry, where the land was supposed to be better, albeit remote. But like us, the land proved finicky. Nothing grew sure or full under one bout of unrelenting sun after another. Cotton buds fell off the plants, the bulbs never growing full size, or they rotted with too much rain. The corn planted early survived, while the late corn withered, and so far, not a new babe born among us. We hurried on deeper into the woods, dodging brittle limbs and swarms of mosquitoes, while listening for snakes and wolves, only slowing down once we reached the live part of the forest, where the grass and moss softened our footfalls and the heavy green leaves gave us cover. It was darker in this part, harder to see, but harder to be seen, with a refreshing coolness that nipped at our necks and feet. After a long day pressed with heat, the coolness pulled down our songs, had us singing under our breath, praise house songs, feeling good songs, the kind we knew before ever coming to this place. For each of us, these songs were different, as all our before heres were different, and some days it's too much work untangling them. We borrow and steal in good measure, sometimes throwing all our before heres in a pot and making them available to the whole of we. She who can't remember her daddy may borrow the memory of mine. Tell me about your ma, one of us would say. What she sang to you at night, how she braided your hair. What kind of dress did she make you for church? What kind of sweet did she give you when you couldn't be soothed by nothing else? But of course, there were things each woman held back, things she deemed too valuable for the pot, or the opposite, things too likely to spoil it whole. We finally stopped when we reached the tree, a large split oak, growing in 2 opposite directions, one reaching skyward, the other stretching out, wide and low, as if trying to reach the sea. Before the crossing could happen, there was a small matter that had to be handled. By this time, Sarah knew the drill. She plopped down on the ground while the other women spread out around her. some kneeling and others sitting in the tree. It was important that all of their heads be higher than hers, a clear demonstration of her guilt. Sarah twirled a leaf between her fingers, a practiced blank expression on her face, as she listened to the details of her crime. Yes, she was in hot water again, but not because she was a troublemaker. That was solely Alice's purview, let Sarah tell it. But more so, because at nearly 17, she was the youngest and still unschooled in the ways of life. She didn't yet understand how to manage white folks and their questions, and how often what was being said aloud had little relation to what was being asked, or the request being made. Nan, the elder of the group, dropped a bucket near Sarah's leg and tipped it upside down with her walking stick. This was the signal that it was safe to talk, that the bucket would trap the sound and make their dealings under night sky unknown. "I still don't get," Nan began, "why you opened your mouth." "I didn't. She asked me," said Sarah. "You could have said you ain't know. Why didn't you?" Sarah stopped her twirling. She could hear the impatience in the old woman's voice, could picture fresh lines of irritation creasing her forehead. She hated being the cause of it. She respected Nan. Didn't want to be the kind of useless woman Nan thought little of, because Nan was one of those women who could do most anything. Nearly every farm had one. Not only could Nan cook and sew, but she could pull a plow, fell a tree, deliver babies, make medicines, and as such, had little compassion for able-bodied young girls like herself who could barely haul water. "'Cause Lucy was in a foul mood, waving a poker in my face. You know how she can be." Stifled tittering broke out among the group. "All right, women. What say you?" Nan said, opening up the floor, but the rest of the group just yawned and waved their hands, ready to get the whole subject over with. "We ain't talk punishment," said Alice, the only woman with a stake in the matter. It was Alice who had actually done the deed in question and had already been punished by the Lucys for it. She had stolen a cut of bacon from the Lucy smokehouse and, in a panic, hidden it under the cookhouse steps. What Sarah was guilty of was the telling. As the youngest of the group, she was still liable to make a wrong move and not necessarily understand why. "Fine," Nan said. She motioned for Junie to hand over a small sack of corn seed she had been carrying. Nan then emptied the sack onto the ground next to the bucket. "All right, your punishment is to pick up each and every seed of this corn." Nan tipped the bucket over and picked it up. "See this?" she said, reaching down and feeling for a notch in the wood with her fingers. "It should reach here. If it don't, we'll know you ain't finished and send you back. But the longer the seed is down, the harder it'll be. You ain't got long before the mice and squirrels come calling." Alice made a whistle-like sound through her teeth. "What now, Alice?" Nan said. "She got the easiest one. She should get the hardest. Something smaller like rice or benny seed." "You see any rice or benny seed round here?" "No, but in Carolina." "This look like Carolina to you?" "At least make her kneel in it first," said Alice. The small germ of anger Sarah had been tamping down threatened to rise up, her face growing warm, a snappy insult flashing across her mind. "Oh, shut up, Alice," Junie said, from her place underneath the tree. "Don't pay her any mind," Nan whispered to Sarah, squeezing her shoulder. Sarah nodded, inching closer to the pile of gray seed, its normally pale yellow color darkened from yesterday's tarring. In this country, they didn't push corn into the soil naked. Instead, the seeds were soaked in a mixture of hot water and sticky black tar, then laid out in the sun to dry, in hopes of staving off squirrels and raccoons who'd eat the seed before it took root. She could smell the tar as she picked faster, her face over the bucket, strangely soothed by the soft tapping sound of the seed hitting bottom. She could feel Alice watching her, the woman's arms folded across her chest, while the rest of the women chatted among themselves, already done with the matter. She knew Alice could be what the women sometimes called a miserable spirit. Everybody had the propensity to be one, but Alice was one of those who embraced the feeling of it, felt more alive in the thrall of it, and if Sarah understood anything about the prevailing wisdom of dealing with such folks, it was to handle them with care. Clearly the road to becoming a we was not a honeyed one. The sun of Texas felt different to each of us. It made us crazy for a time, and that crazy was called many things: homesickness, grief, drapetomania. What forged us together was more than circumstance. In some ways, we were more different than alike. None of us the same age or born in the same place. Some of us knew the folks that birthed us, and some of us didn't. Some of us were born Christians. Others came to it roundabout, if at all. Some of us practiced conjure and practical magic. Others steered far clear. Some of us had born children and lost them, while others were little more than virgins. We were bound together by what tends to bind women like us together. Often, that doesn't make folks kin, makes them trapped, and that can make them hateful toward one another unless it's redirected and harnessed towards something else altogether. The others began without waiting for Sarah, Nan, or Alice. Sarah could hear them praying on the other side of the tree. Someone was singing, a throaty, drawn-out hymn that sounded like a dirge, more vibration than song. And it remained that way, low and thrumming, until Nan checked the bucket and emptied the corn seed back into the sack. She tied off the bag and handed it to Alice, and then carried the bucket over to the women singing, where she placed it inside the circle of women and turned it over. Sarah and Alice followed her, joining along the outer edge. Nan moved around the circle, dotting foreheads with oil as the song grew louder. The vibration grew so strong, it felt as if the group was being pulled deep inside it, made weightless, now swaying and rocking, like leaves in a strong wind. Junie moved into the circle, and the women locked hands around her. Sarah watched as the woman spun and danced and cried. Moonlight shifted through the trees and lit up Junie's hair, braided and tucked at the base of her head, the long crooked toes of her bare feet, the faded brown trousers rolled over at the ankle. Junie was the only one among them who wore pants. A set of Harlow's old trousers she wore tied around her waist with thin rope. And that was often how Sarah thought of her, the one who wore pants. It was a holdover from Sarah's arrival, this need for categorization, to understand this new world and the people inside it by their habits and tics, their wants and weaknesses. Junie slowed down, turning her tear-streaked face to the light, before stumbling out of the circle and taking her place back along the perimeter. Patience went next, inching her way into the circle with small steps. She didn't dance or shout. Instead, she just stood there, in stillness, with her eyes closed, her hands clasped together, a strand of rosary beads dangling from her wrist, whispering a prayer. She was the only Catholic among them, but she didn't seem to mind it, if others used their faith to separate themselves from others. She wasn't one of them. She needed the gathering part, she told Sarah one day. When Sarah's turn came, she entered the circle, unsure of what to do. She didn't feel much like shouting or dancing. She liked the song enough, liked the sound of the women singing, but she couldn't drop down into it, the way the others seemed to. She wasn't a Christian, but the other women didn't know that, and didn't seem to care, really. This was just a means to open the door. It was your business whose help you sought, whether it be Jesus or the moon or your dead. She spun around, repeated a prayer she heard others pray, whispering the words over and over while she waited for something to happen. She wanted to feel whatever it was that made the other women so joyful, whatever made them rock on their heels or fan their arms with glee. She wanted to know for herself what created that dazed, wide-eyed expression they often gave her afterward, like they were still somewhere else and hadn't yet returned to the constraints of this world. She danced, and she rocked, but nothing happened past her own self, past her own muscles moving as she directed them to. No Holy Spirit descended upon her. No burgeoning warmth washed over her. At the edge of the circle, Lulu began shouting, her eyes closed and fists clenched. The women, recognizing the presence of spirit, moved to encircle Lulu, making it safe for her to move deeper into the sacred realm. Just like that, Sarah's time in the circle was up, where she thought if anything was to be felt, if any spirit was to make its presence known, it would be there, inside the heat of the women. Sarah rejoined the outer edge of the circle, where she watched Lulu go deeper, jumping higher and pumping her arms, as if on the verge of flight. That seemed fitting, that if anyone would be a vessel, it would be Lulu. Not because Lulu was more righteous or upstanding than any of the others. In fact, most would say the opposite. It was more because there was little veneer between her and the world. Lulu was guileless. She'd say the meanest thing possible directly to your face with no shred of sass or anger in her voice, then get up and make you a cup of tea. She was fully a product of the moment itself, with little regard to the seconds before or after. And still the sight of Lulu shouting and dancing made Sarah feel worse. Locking hands like this was one of the few times Sarah felt of the women, when she felt like they were something more than just a gaggle of strangers fastened together. But she found this night she could take little comfort in it. She knew it took time to figure out a place, to learn its climate and its ways, what flora, fauna, or predators it might kill you with. So it made sense that it took time for her gods and her dead to find her here, to cross the many miles of land and sea, not to mention if there were protocols necessary to tangle with the gods here already. Kiowa gods, Cherokee gods, German gods. However, the presence of Lulu shouting in front of her said different. This woman crying and dancing so freely made it clear to Sarah that other people's gods had no problem locating them. So, if it wasn't Texas, with its strange air and stubborn fields, its plagues of pestilence and grifters, then surely it had to be her. It had to be something wrong about her, or in her, that kept them from coming, that left her in this strange place, with little to no aid in this world. Chapter 2. Days later, over the din of pickaxes and hoes, we could hear Mrs. Lucy shrieking. One sharp cry, followed by another long, high-pitched wail. No one cast an eye in the direction of the sound. We went on pushing oat seed knuckle-deep into the earth, as if the sound of Mrs. Lucy going into labor was the most natural thing in the world. The shrieking kept on, at turns growing louder, then fading out, only to start up again. "Think Nan need a hand up there?" Junie said after a while. "She'll send Silas if she need us," Patience replied. We knew Nan would tend to the birth, despite Mr. Lucy's incessant railing about finding a suitable doctor to tend to her this go-round. Everyone knew it was all talk. This part of the country was still desolate, with few neighbors to speak of, and even if he had a connection to a bona fide doctor willing to make the journey, it was unlikely he could afford the fee. The boy Silas ran up, waving his bony arms. He was a thin wisper covered in dust, his shirt tail skimming his ashy knees. "Nan, won't you?" he cried. "Come now." "Why, who, baby?" Patience asked him. He shrugged, one naked shoulder poking out of the neck of his shirt. She stood up and crooked her index finger at him. "Come here." He stared at her for a moment but didn't move. "I said come here," Patience said. The boy ambled over. She sighed. She shifted the shirt so it centered around his neck. "Boy, you are a sight." She licked her thumb and cleared his face of sleep and crust while he squirmed. "Who's she asked for?" Junie asked him. He shrugged again. Patience pinched his shoulder. "Open your mouth when somebody speak to you." He gave Patience a defiant look and pulled back from her. "Didn't say. She just say come now and bring hot water." A flash of anger crossed Patience's face. He saw it and ran, back in the direction of the Lucy's house. "Get back here, Silas!" His legs slowed a moment, so she knew he heard her, but he kept on anyway. He was skinny and fast, but Patience was faster. Years of worry had made her wiry and taut, and she leaped over to him in a few quick paces, her skirt gathered in her fist. She grabbed a hold of his shoulder and pinched it hard, turning him toward her. His small face twisted up and he let out a ragged breath. She bent her face close to his. "Don't you run from me. I'm your mother, not them. You listen to me. You hear?" He nodded, his eyes wide. She wrapped her arms around him, but he was stiff as wood in her arms. He pulled back from her and leaned his head in the direction of the Lucy's house. "All right," she said, dropping her arms. He turned and ran away. She watched him until he reached the edge of the yard, a flicker of disappointment flaring up in her chest. She probably wouldn't see him the rest of the day, and this was how the one moment she had with him went. She went back to her place on the row and crouched back down, wrapping her fingers tight around the handle of the pickaxe she'd left lying in the dirt. She slammed it into the ground a few times, until she could let the air out of her body slowly, and then slower still. She wasn't sure when it happened, the moment when her boy became more theirs than hers. Initially, she didn't protest too much at the idea of him being a houseboy. She figured he'd spend most of his time helping Nan, and that seemed all right, as he was a frail child, often too sickly to follow them around in the fields all day. Most of the time, she worried about harm coming to him in that small, evil house, how quickly and often he'd become the target of all the discord that flowed between the Lucys. Every time she got an evening with him, she checked his back, his legs, his arms, for lash marks, for bruises, but she got fewer and fewer evenings with him now. He slept in the Lucys' house, to aid with the Lucys' children, and getting him back to share a meal became harder and harder to come by. "He can't be spared now," she was always told. And worse, he didn't even bother to sneak away to see her anymore. There was a time when he did, dipping by the loom for a moment to make her laugh or swinging by the cabin, while they were finishing up their sewing. Now, if he came at all, it was because she begged Nan to send him for a few minutes when he wouldn't be missed. Now, when he came, he'd make it plain how much he didn't want to be there. He no longer liked the ash cake she made in the fireplace, singeing her fingers in the process. He didn't want the small corn husk dolls she made him. He no longer liked sitting in her lap and listening to tall tales or singing with her. At first, she thought he was just worried about being punished, so worried he couldn't relax. But soon, it became clear to her. That wasn't it. He no longer felt at ease, so far away from the Lucys. He missed them now, it seemed, much like he used to miss her. Patience ran her fingers over the gaping hole she made. She pushed the dirt around, making a mound and pushing the seed down inside it. It was early, the position of sun in the sky told her, but she felt so tired she thought the sun must be wrong. "Where'd you go?" Patience said suddenly, from her place at the end of the row. "Why me?" asked Sarah. "'Cause you still slow as sorghum syrup." "Like molasses." "Slower, like cold tar," said Alice. The women chuckled. "Now you go on." Sarah groaned and headed off after Silas. Patience watched her, hoping the girl might tell her something more about what she saw inside the house. All this time, Nan had been telling her not to worry, but it didn't ease her mind any. Instead, she suspected that Nan was holding something back, not in a malicious way, in a protective way. But if her boy was in danger, Patience wanted to know, even if it didn't seem like there was much she could do about it. What was being somebody's mother, if not that? Sensing danger and putting your body in between it and your child. Maybe she couldn't sing him songs at night anymore, nor wash his face and hands in the morning. But maybe this she could still do. Sarah did not rush in the hot, humid air. Silas ran on ahead, only slowing down once, to peek over his shoulder at her. She waved him on. "Go ahead, I'm coming." She peeled off in the direction of the well, where she filled 2 buckets with water. It took her a few minutes to link each bucket to the opposite ends of a shoulder yoke and balance them proper across the back of her neck. Gingerly, she inched toward the yard, with a close watch on the rim of each bucket, only spilling a cupful before Lizzie let loose another wild, piercing shriek. When Sarah reached the cookhouse, a small building with a large hearth and square table, she transferred both buckets into a large iron kettle and got a fire going. Nan appeared in the doorway, her face shining with sweat, a long white apron cresting over her ankles. "Why you doing that out here instead of in the house?" "Oh, I didn't think to—" "Girl, I declare," Nan said, sighing in exasperation. "Hurry up." She turned and walked away. Sarah ladled hot water into a pitcher, wrapped a cloth around the handle, and carried it into the Lucys' house. She was blinded for a moment by the sudden darkness, an unfamiliar earthy scent washing over her. "In here," Nan said, calling her from a bedroom at the end of a long, wide hallway. Inside the room, Sarah placed the pitcher down on the floor next to Nan, without looking at Mrs. Lucy, drenched in sweat on the edge of her chair, a thin slip scrunched around her pale thighs. Sarah averted her eyes and headed back out of the room. "Where you going? Get back here," Nan said, rubbing the pregnant woman's stomach. "To fetch more hot water," said Sarah, though she had no intention of returning to the dank, dark room. "I need a hand. Get behind her." Sarah forced herself to move closer. She didn't even want to be in the same room. The whole process stirred up a wild anxiousness inside her. Whenever women grew big with child, their bodies growing alien and monstrous, she found herself watching them with suspicion, though she couldn't place what it was she found frightening about them. Maybe it was the deep, wide bellies, so heavy they could tip a woman over on the row, sending them head first into the stalks, or the sight of them unclothed, a new taut round world affixed to their bodies, or the muck that descended from them when the babies came spilling out, one after another, or the incessant need of the thing once it arrived, the swaddled bundles lying underneath a shelter of leaves at the edge of a potato bed, the constant sound of crying and mewling they emitted throughout the morning, only growing louder as the day went on. She couldn't forget how the births turned the women on her old farm in South Carolina adrift, made them wan and stiff-legged as they chopped and weeded, sometimes with the babe hoisted on their backs. They spent the evening sewing and fighting off sleep while the child fed or cried, then fed. But the worst part was the artless rebellion of their bodies after too many births. How their spines tipped forward or their uteruses descended lower and lower, suddenly trying to meet the air. And how some never healed right after the 5th or 8th birth. How one woman was banished altogether, sent to the woods to live in a cave after her inside parts never mended. The woman lost all control over her bodily functions. Rivers of piss and shit dribbled with such frequency and without warning that all the time she was afraid to eat or drink, the smallest excretions causing her great pain and great embarrassment. Ever since then, Sarah looked askance at the whole birth enterprise, and while she was surprised Lizzie of all people rekindled this anxiety in her, it just confirmed how little she wanted to do with the entire process. She had no desire to be bedside while the woman shrieked and squirmed. She didn't care to witness the elaborate protocols doctoring women, such as Nan, were insistent about following, in hopes of helping a new soul transition into the world proper. And most of all, she didn't want to be in the thick of it herself, with a trapped soul inside her, sucking her dry and tipping her organs about, or later, nursing at her breasts or cradled in her lap, where eventually it'd be taken away, the moment she allowed herself to love it. "Rub her back, will you?" said Nan. Sarah ignored the parts of herself that wanted to run elsewhere, that would instead be grateful to be cast back outside in the sticky heat, sowing winter oats with the rest of the women. Instead, she did as she was told and rubbed the woman's back in slow circles, her fingers damp from the sweat-soaked slip. Just how long would she have to do this? Lizzie let out a loud moan, her body sliding down off the chair. Sarah slipped her arms underneath the woman's armpits and felt the woman's weight sink down into her. Lizzie's hair was now plastered to her head, her breathing slow and wide. Sarah looked down at the lolling head, the neck no longer able to support it, and she found herself looking for the seam of the woman, as if they were just a few tired stitches holding Mrs. Lucy together. "My first line in, I had 6 women in the room with me," Lizzie said. A sudden wave of pain seemed to hit her then, and her head snapped back into Sarah's chest with a thud. Nan sat opposite the two, now squatting on a makeshift stool, waiting to catch the baby. "Mm-hmm. Who was there?" she said, pressing a warm compress on Lizzie's swollen stomach. "My ma, both my sisters, Mrs. Kennelly from the farm over, and Mother Amy from the church," Lizzie breathed. The child seemed to be crowning now, and Nan motioned for Sarah to hold the woman firmly, lest she sink down when the child slid free. Sarah tightened her grip and closed her eyes. "Send for them, won't you?" Lizzie said, her voice breaking. Nan began pressing low on the woman's abdomen. "Come on, Mrs. Lizzie, push a little bit more." "It was a storm that night and they all had to stay over. There wasn't even enough room for them all, but they wanted to be close to me and the baby." A long, low moan stopped the anecdote. Then a surge of water spurted out from the woman, splashing Nan's arms, so high it soaked her rolled-up sleeves. Sarah was startled, but Nan barely blinked. She just reset her footing and urged the woman on. Within seconds, the baby emerged, the small, slippery body coming so fast, Nan almost lost her grip. "I got you, honey," Nan said, gripping the child firmly and placing it in her lap. She cleared its mouth with her finger and wiped it off with a warm, damp cloth. The pale red creature drew breath and screamed. "Is it a boy?" Lizzie asked. Yes, it is." "Well, that's a relief," Lizzie said, a slow grin spreading over her face. "Let me see him." Nan wrapped the child up and held him out to Lizzie. Sarah looked down at the wrinkled infant, its mother slumped over and leaning toward him, and couldn't resist the urge to extract herself. She slowly began trying to pull her arms free. "Where are you going?" "We have to wait for the afterbirth," Nan said. Sarah strengthened her hold, and a few minutes later, the dark purple mass slipped down and out, Nan catching it in a waiting chamber pot. Sarah could see it, wet and jiggling, the long pink cord extending from its center. Nan set the child down and tied off the cord. She then cut it, firing the end with the flame of a lit candle. Sarah had never seen an afterbirth up close. She just knew there were many folks who attributed a good deal of their misfortune in life to this moment, to the separation of their body from this quivering mass. She didn't know why exactly, only that it needed to be buried at the base of a good tree, and it needed to be close by, where one could look after it and visit it when necessary. She didn't know what the fallout was when one couldn't do that. The afflictions people named were all different. Water in the lungs, sickness in the head, a deadening of an arm or leg. Almost anything could be attributed to the mishandling of this sacred thing, and one's untimely separation from the tree or hollow where it was buried. "Here, take 'em, while I get her cleaned up," Nan said, holding out the mewling, crying child to Sarah. Sarah hesitated before taking the pale pink babe in her arms. She looked down at it, the blue veins crossing its face, the tiny pursed lips, the heavy eyelids snapping open and closed. He looked harmless, not unlike a sleeping chick. "Oh, what damage will you come to do in this world?" she thought, and because she was holding him and could feel the child settling into her arms, she wondered if they could speak this way. Perhaps she could make her thoughts travel down and out her fingers and into his small, soft body. She could plant these notions inside him while he was still wet and forming, like setting seeds in damp soil. "I should dash your head in right now," she threatened, grinning at the child suddenly. "How many lives could I save just by doing that?" But you'll be different, won't you? A righteous man in the hell carnival." The child began screaming. "Bring him here!" Lizzie called out from the bed. Sarah handed the baby over and watched as Lizzie put the child to her breast, but he couldn't latch on, couldn't draw down the thick yellow milk of the first days. "Here, take him," Lizzie sighed. Sarah took the squirming child back in her arms, while Lizzie sat up squeezing her breast, trying to coax milk out. "I thought this time feeding would be easier," she said. "I didn't have much milk with the first two either, but our old house girls had plenty. We never wanted for milk when they were around. I didn't think much of it at the time, but you know that Roberta had a baby every time Mother did." Sarah felt stuck under the weight of this small, pale boy. Nan had disappeared with her tools, motioning for Sarah to stay put until she returned. Lizzie continued pressing on her left breast until a thick smear of fluid trickled from her nipple. "Oh, give him here!" Sarah gave the child back to Lizzie. He opened his mouth to scream, and Lizzie slid the glob into the child's mouth. "Well, Roberta was a married woman. I suppose if I want plenty of milk round here, I got to get y'all husbands," Lizzie said, chuckling. "Young Master Will, we got to get these gals married off now, don't we?" It was all too close. Sarah surveyed the room, looking for a task that would get her out of that house. She grabbed a sack and began stuffing all the soiled linens and bedclothes into it. The baby opened his mouth again, and Lizzie jammed her nipple inside, just as a wave of activity bubbled up from the front part of the house. The sound of Lizzie's older children bursting in, now stomping and screaming in the front room. "Go get them," Lizzie said. Sarah stepped out of the bedroom and went down the hall, where 4-year-old Louisa was chasing her older brother, 5-year-old Ollie, around the table. "Stop it!" Louisa screamed as Ollie whooped and yelled. "Both of you stop that running and hush up," Sarah said as Ollie ran toward Sarah, taking cover behind her legs. "Yo ma wants you," she said as she steered the two children into the bedroom. "Come on and meet Lil William," Lizzie said. Louisa and Ollie inched toward the bed as if afraid. "Come on, he won't bite." Sarah grabbed the sack and beelined for the door as the children crowded around the bed. "Gal, come back when you're done," Lizzie yelled after her. "You know he won't sleep through the night." Before Nan could get dinner started, she needed to get cleaned up. She placed her tools in a pot of water and set them to boil. Any unused herbs needed to be set aside for inspection, that nothing got wet or damp, lest it would mildew and rot. In a small room off the back side of the cookhouse, she kept her few belongings, and the rolled-up pallet where she slept most nights, when she wasn't needed overnight in the Lucy's house. Only on special occasions, such as crossings and holidays, did she wander down to the quarters and sleep some portion of the night alongside the rest of the women. On a small bench, she poured some warm water from a kettle into a bowl and stripped out of her clothes. With a rag and a small slice of soap, she washed herself, with particular care around her fingers and under her nails. In the corner of the room sat the waiting chamber pot with Lizzie's afterbirth in it. The wriggling, purplish mass looked like it might slither away at any moment. She watched it from the corner of her eye as she washed, as if whatever came out of a Lucy could surprise her if she wasn't careful. She chuckled to herself at the thought. Now, in a fresh set of clothes, she felt better, the grit and sweat of Lizzie's labor off her. She felt like she could breathe. She pushed the soiled heap of clothing to the side. Scrubbing them would have to wait. She walked over to the chamber pot and peered down at it. She had already inspected it once, but she did so again, just to be thorough, just to make sure it was whole and hadn't come out piecemeal. Otherwise, she'd have to go back and wait for Lizzie to pass the rest of it. A fragmented placenta meant all kinds of danger. But this one looked healthy and whole. The only concern now was the matter of disposing it. She had to admit she was puzzled. She hadn't delivered many white children, and the few she had were the offspring of indentured immigrants, Irish mostly, half of which were deemed fallen due to their relationships with black men. For the black mothers she normally cared for, there were very specific protocols for each stage of delivery, all kinds of things that needed to be done to usher in the new spirit and to keep bad spirits at bay so they couldn't do harm to the child or mother. Normally, she might bury the afterbirth near the trunk of a tree. Other times, she'd salt it and burn it and protect the ashes for the first few weeks of the baby's life. The burning would take hours, but Silas could watch over it and set the ash aside if she explained it to him proper. Yet none of that seemed necessary. She picked up the bowl and walked out of the cookhouse and over to the far side of the yard, past the smokehouse and around the barn, to the small pen where the few hogs the Lucys owned were rustling about. Fat and noisy, they grunted and squealed. A spotted black one moved toward her, sniffing for food. She stood and watched them for a moment, before flinging the bowl's contents over the railing. She watched as the greedy hogs ran toward the bloody material and devoured it. For all the years she had been midwifing, she felt a tether to the children she had delivered, the ones who survived and ones who didn't. They stayed with her, a genteel chorus that lived in the corners of her life. She didn't mind it, really. The alternative seemed lonelier. But she wanted no binding connection to this one. She'd see him and his mother every day, and that seemed plenty. All those detailed rituals she usually did were there to help protect the child and mother, but in her estimation, Lizzie and baby William needed no such thing. And if they did, she damned well wouldn't be the one to provide them. Chapter 3. New Cotton was up the first time we saw Zeke. We were eating our mid-morning meal of ash cake and coffee, passing a tin cup of the bitter hot liquid around from person to person. This was but another complaint we had against this wily country. Here, coffee had come to mean nearly any vile warm drink one could think of. It could be made of anything, pecans, parched corn, even walnuts, and yet they still called it coffee and served it at every meal. We only had a few minutes more to eat, so we almost didn't notice the man trailing behind Mr. Lucy like a shadow. On occasion, Harlow rented builders and masons, men we only saw in passing, erecting one leaning structure or another, so the man's arrival didn't trouble us. We didn't wonder after the man, who he might be or what task he was brought to execute. Instead, we concentrated on Mr. Lucy, still some distance away, his eyes obscured by the brim of a large hat. We couldn't hear him, though we could see without looking, his head cocked in our direction, his mouth moving, a likely river of instructions and invectives streaming from his lips. All spines straightened, all antennas leaned toward the two men as we shifted our bodies in the opposite direction, palming the last bits of ash cake, draining what was left of the foul, now lukewarm coffee, before heading off in the direction of the potato slips. Later, when we made lore of this moment, we'd say the opposite, that we saw a monster coming, that the sky darkened, and a lone rooster crowed and flapped its wings, even though the sun was long done rising. Anybody claiming to be a seer would say they felt his presence, that the moment they saw the man, they knew something awful would come to pass. We didn't see the two men again until dusk. By then, we were sticky with the day, our blouses soiled with sweat, our hems ragged and crusted with dirt. We were in the yard again, in the midst of our evening work. Patience was wrestling with the crank, grinding the corn needed to make our dinner, while the rest of us readied a sack of cotton for spinning. We plucked husks, seeds, and lint from the fiber, then carded it, combing the material with long wire teeth until it lay flat and pliable. We could still smell what Nan had cooked the Lucys, a pungent dish of roasted meat that made our mouths water. We prayed she'd save some bit of it for us, even if it was just the gravy, flavored with bacon grease. It was her we were listening for, so when Mr. Lucy and the man pushed into our circle, we were sorely disappointed, still wrapped up in our fantasies of corn pone drizzled with gravy. Mr. Lucy motioned Patience to shut down the crank and sit. It was then we got our first good look at the man. He was about a head taller than Mr. Lucy, a broad, strapping figure, the way we figured Moses might have looked when he parted the Red Sea. He had sleepy brown eyes and a scruffy beard that obscured his mouth. Almost immediately, we began to anticipate the tasks he could take off our hands. He could split rails or help us clear the land on the other side of the farm, where our tiny garden plots were plundered mercilessly by the wandering roots of thirsty trees. If any of us thought him handsome, she made no indication to the rest, and maybe secretly, for a lone moment, we were gladdened by the idea of him, someone to play the lady for, to adorn ourselves in perfumes and baubles, and carry on harmless, ongoing flirtations. This was true for those among us who enjoyed men. We would have been happy to tease one another about him, to make him believe we were half in love with him, and entertain ourselves with silly, jealous bouts where we'd force him to choose one of us. And those among us who found men scary, or altogether more trouble than they were worth, would find our games comical and take bets on which woman might best the other, and it is they who would get in between the two parties, if the game grew sour and someone really got attached to the man in question. "This here's Zeke," Harlow said. "He gon' be with us a while. Help him out, will you? Like good Christians should. He'll stay in the barn." We nodded. The man's face was a blank, his eyes looking past us. "Nan's cooking up a meal for him," Harlow went on. "Patience, you take it up to him when he's done, here?" "Why me? He got 2 legs." "Gal, don't mar my peace," Harlow said, glaring at her. "You want some heat on your back?" Patience didn't answer, and the two men walked away. She went back to the crank, where she muttered under her breath about being chosen for the task. I ain't his mother. I ain't suckle him. She cranked the mill faster now, the creaky gears drowning out all sound, all voices, making it suddenly too hard to hear one another. It was dark by the time Patience approached the barn with Zeke's dinner. She stood at the edge of the doorway, peering into its black insides, the dank smell of wet hay rushing toward her. She listened for the man but didn't hear him, only the rustling of a few pigs in the pen adjacent to the barn. Far off, somewhere a dog was howling. Hey, mister, she called out. He stepped forward, so sudden and quiet-like he startled her. The moonlight was dim, and she could barely see his face. What was you doing in there? She asked. Resting. Oh. That struck her as curious, that he seemed to be there without a task or assignment. They ain't give you a pine knot? Yeah, but don't need it. Dark suits me fine. She said. Another curious thing. Here. She shoved the tray of food at him, corn pone with gravy and 2 slices of ham, covered with a clean piece of homespun. He didn't take the tray, or even seem interested in its contents. He smiled weakly, a small gap between his 2 front teeth. It smells good, he said, but I don't really like to eat until after. After? After what? She tried again, pushing the tray toward his barreled chest until it touched. Here! Come in. You supposed to stay a while. He grabbed hold of the tray, putting his hands on top of hers. Patience jerked backward, the tray tilted, warm gravy spilling onto his hands and shirt. Damn it! Sorry, she said, uprighting the tray. Take the food and I'll see if Nan has something else you can change into. He fanned out the shirt. It'll dry. Again, that weak, strange smile passed over his lips. He stepped closer to her. Don't be scared of me. I hate for gals to be afraid of me, he said, looking her in the eyes so intensely, she dropped her gaze. I'll be gentle as I can, he murmured. It hit her suddenly what he was saying, and she dropped the tray, jumping back when it hit the ground, splashing onto her skirt. He looked at it for a moment, as if only slightly disappointed. Never mind all that. Come on in, Zeke said. You a traveling nigger? He nodded. And you supposed to be a kind one? That it? Yes, miss. I tries to be. And there was that strange smile again, the cautious, pleading gaze, like he wanted her to acknowledge this kindness in him, that here he was, talking to her plainly and reasonably, instead of dragging her into the barn like another stockman might. But she was too stunned to care about all that. She stepped backward, watching the man closely as she put more and more space between them. They stared at each other for a long moment before he turned away, disappearing into the barn. She spun and ran full speed into the hazy darkness. She was tempted to run as far as she could, but the problem was, that wasn't very far. She had a better idea than the other women what lay at the end of most attempts: more land, little food, and an infinite number of white men with guns. And what she understood more than most about all those white men with guns in this strange and new country was how arbitrary and varied their cruelty could be. Yes, it could be glittering and wild, but more often, it was ordinary and banal and monotonous. It was this ordinary type of cruelty that disappeared her husband, Jacob. She thought of him as she ran through the yard and back to the cabin full of women. Damn you! It was Jacob's fault that she was still here alone, running from a dark barn in the dead of night from a man the Lucys brought for the sole purpose of mating with her. She thought herself a widow, and if anyone asked, she said Jacob had died, though she had no earthly idea whether he was alive or dead. It's not that she wanted to wish death upon him if he was still breathing. It was just the easiest way to finally wrap her mind around the fact that he wasn't coming back. It was the waiting that had almost done her in, that made the days impossible to get through, that made her feel as if she was on the verge of imploding. She came to this place a wife, newly separated from her husband, and while the couple had lived most of their married days apart, with her fate being tied to the whims of a wealthy widow on a farm in northern Louisiana, and he being a freeman, working the ports, he came up almost monthly, offering the widow free labor in exchange for being allowed to visit his wife and their young son Silas. When the widow died and Patience and Silas ended up here, Jacob followed. He showed up some months later, not long after they all arrived in Navarro. Harlow was cordial at first, got Jacob to help him build the first 2 cabins, and even raise the barn. And it seemed like maybe the couple could have a similar arrangement akin to their life in Louisiana. But as time passed, Patience and Jacob realized that was less and less likely. Jacob still couldn't afford to buy her and Silas's freedom, as that price tag was always a goalpost in motion. But worse than that, freedmen weren't allowed to be in the country long. Texas had a law against them. Without a petition or a white man to vouch for him, he couldn't stay without risk of being jailed or re-enslaved. Patience begged Harlow to vouch for Jacob, but he refused. Said he didn't believe in free niggers. "Tell you what, though, I'm not unreasonable," Harlow said to her. "Jacob could sign himself over to me. That would solve it. The law couldn't touch him then, and nothing would change. He'd be here working on the farm just like he'd been doing." For days, Patience couldn't even bring herself to mention Harlow's proposed solution to Jacob. Every time she looked at him, the words burrowed themselves deeper into her flesh. It wasn't long before Harlow told Jacob himself, gave her husband an ultimatum with a ticking clock in the middle of winter. And for days after, she and Jacob fought like they never had before. "Over my dead body," she told him. "Ain't up to you. It's up to me. I swear you do this, you gonna have to marry one of them 'cause we through. Woman, you gonna quit me when I'm trying to stay with you? You really are touched." "Maybe. Still don't make what I say any less true." That was the thing about husbands. You know them better than they know themselves, and she knew Jacob wouldn't survive it. He didn't have the kind of soul that could parse it for long. In short bouts, he managed fine. After that, he had to take off for a long haul on a fishing boat, or a gig managing horses for a stagecoach, or upriver somewhere, where he'd haul freight for any of the companies shipping goods back and forth. Too long here, and he'd die. Besides, didn't he know how fast he'd come to hate her and Silas under this new arrangement? How soon he'd see his family and the coffle as the very same thing? His being there for so long had already changed things between them. She had begun to think the distance they had before suited them better. After all, wasn't love served best in tiny bits? When one could eat it whole, when she could wear her good face and he his, when she could starch her one good dress and do up her hair for the short time they'd spend together. A period so short they never had to watch the other get beaten to the ground or cut real low. Hadn't they been better for it? To never have to look at the other with pity or shame? By the time she reached the cabin, she was out of breath. She pushed the heavy door wide open, her breathing so ragged she couldn't speak. "Somebody after you?" asked Alice, sitting up suddenly. No, Peyton said, shutting the door closed. "What then?" Junie asked, squinting as she broke a piece of thread with her teeth. Patience didn't answer. She sat down on a stool for a long moment, then immediately stood up. She paced around the front door, pressing it shut over and over again. She wandered over to the lone shelf that held that week's rations and began moving them around. The small sack of corn now on the left, the gill of salt now to the right. "Pay, what is it?" said Lulu. Patience shook her head. She squatted next to her own pallet and yanked out all the stuffing, moss, corn husk, hay, old rags, and then, one by one, began stuffing it all back. "He a breedin' nigger." She laughed, a high-pitched, terrible laugh. She shook her head again, the stark, outraged laughter growing choked in her throat. "Y'all hear me? Lucy done brought us a breedin' nigger." The next day, Patience fished her rosary out from its special hiding place and put it around her neck for protection. She wouldn't speak to us, only to it. All day we heard her whispering as she fingered the beads. "Mother Mary, never was it told that any asking your help was turned away. Mother Mary, I run to you for my protection." Those of us who consulted other earthly sources of help were at a loss. None of us wanted to get close enough to the man to collect the required skin and hair or fluids needed to do darker deeds. And maybe foolishly, we hoped it wouldn't come to that. That maybe Patience's prayers would be answered, that the Lucys would grow to see the error of their ways. And by dusk, we thought maybe it was so, as we hadn't seen Mr. Lucy or Zeke all day. We went about our evening routines, casting lots to determine who would grind that night's corn and who'd have to stand over the hot fire to bake it. "I don't care what that dice say. I ain't doing it. I did it yesterday." "So? That's your own fault if you threw better." And while laughing at us, Patience did a dangerous thing. For one lone second, she forgot about them, the whole ordeal slipping to the back of her mind. Like tales of his namesake, Mr. Lucy could sometimes just appear. All of a sudden, he was there, standing behind her, and without a word or syllable even uttered between them, he snatched Patience toward him with one hand, striking her with the other. In his fist, there was a bundle of reedy branches and ragged green leaves. He struck at her bare skin, her arms, neck, and face. He let go and she sunk to her knees. "Do it," or tomorrow will be worse," he said, walking away, disappearing as suddenly as he came. We helped her up, took her to Nan, who applied thick salves to the nasty, stinging welts that sprung up on her skin. The Lucys were often reluctant to use the long-tail whips so common across the South, not because they objected to the cruelty of such methods of correction, but mostly because it wasn't economically feasible. Black snake whips and cat-o'-nine tails flayed the skin, did damage to the muscle, put a person down for days, weeks even, depending on the number of lashes. Not to mention, it could affect resale value. Those were luxuries a yeoman farmer couldn't afford, with only a handful of folks in the fields. Patience took a nap and woke up hours later, the heavy numbing effect of the salve wearing off. She blinked at the stars, staring down at her from the holes in the roof, the small gaps where the logs didn't meet all the way, the spaces along the ridge that leaked every time it rained. She was alone in the cabin, and she was grateful for the rare moment of quiet. Muffled chatter began to seep in from outside. She opened the door and the chatter paused to ask her questions she had no use for. Was she hungry? Did she need more salve? Did she want some tea? She didn't answer, didn't want questions, or their eyes, or their speculating. Whatever was waiting for her in that barn probably awaited them too, but not today. She didn't know why that mattered, but it did. She walked past them and continued up toward the yard. She thought about Jacob, about the dark woods at the edge of the farm, where she could lie out for a few days. Someone else would have to go in her place, and maybe that'd give her enough time to figure out a solution. She knew just the place, a gully with a thicket of low-slung ash trees, and the memory of it stung her. It was the last place she saw Jacob. After arguing about the ultimatum for a week, Jacob went ahead and signed himself over to Harlow. She was angry about it, but Jacob convinced her he could handle it. Besides, they just needed to wait for the weather to break, he said. Then he'd get her and Silas out of there. Jacob was good at geography, had a bird's sense of direction, so his plan didn't seem far-fetched to her, but that winter was brutal, and several months in the cold, cramped cabin, with not only a sickly, screaming toddler, but 4 other women, changed his tune. He picked fights with Patience, with the women, with Harlow. "You sure Silas mine?" he'd ask her, whenever he wanted to get a row started. The child was too sickly and frail, he'd claim. She must have been running around with someone else back then. She spent most of the season in a state of silent seething, clutching her rosary beads and whispering the Pater Noster, which, for some reason she couldn't figure, only made him madder. He got Harlow to agree to let him build a new addition onto the cabin, but the two came to blows before he could finish. Harlow got a fist in his eye, and Jacob took off running into the woods. Late that night, she snuck out to take him a change of clothing, a blanket, and some food. She figured he was in the gully, where they used to go whenever they wanted to be alone, but she hadn't wanted to be there with him in a long time, and almost forgot how to find it. She found him there, shivering and tired. "It'll blow over in a few days," she told him. "Lucy can't afford to lose you." "We should go now," he said, clutching her arm, wrapping his body around hers. "We can't. Silas won't make it. Not in this weather." She couldn't see Jacob's face, but could feel the coldness in his demeanor return. "You didn't see him on the trip here," she went on. "That cholera going round? He barely survived it." Jacob didn't say anything for a while. He let go of her, brought his face down to hers, and whispered low into her neck, "Leave him." The ground underneath her feet shifted. The trees in front of her grew soft and blurry, the branches melding into the dark sky. "What?" she whispered, shifting her body backward in a futile attempt to see his face. A cold gust of wind sent the branches of the trees clacking. The sound of it felt like it was inside of her, the sharp edge of her heart beating. "I ain't hear you," she said. "Say it again, you bastard." He didn't say anything more, just pulled the blanket around his shoulders, tucking it tight under his arms. Maybe she didn't hear that. It was just this land playing tricks on her. Jacob would never say such a vile thing. He rubbed his hands together. "How much food did you bring?" She handed over the small basket she brought, filled with corn pone and a couple pieces of salt pork wrapped in cloth. He stuffed a chunk of corn pone into his mouth. "It's not enough," he said, chewing. "It's enough till I get back over here tomorrow," she told him. "Lucy will cool off in a couple of days and you'll come back. You'll act sorry. He'll make a big show, and then it'll be over with. And when it's warmer, we'll figure out a plan," she heard herself say, the words tumbling out fast and jumbled and high-pitched. He nodded. "You say so." "I do." She forced herself to kiss him goodbye. her mind churning all the while, arguing with itself. He didn't say that. Yes, he did. He didn't say it. You know he did. If he said it, he would have said it again. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, pulling away from him. He nodded again, and she took off through the trees. The next night, he wasn't there, and she found herself surprised by his absence. He must have moved to another hiding place, she figured. He'd be back around any day now. He wouldn't leave with those words between them. He wouldn't leave without making it right. But he never returned to the farm or the gully. With each day that passed, she was sure the next day would be the day when he'd return. Ask her forgiveness for all his misdeeds. Be the Jacob she knew, the Jacob who showed up after long bouts away. That Jacob was kind and warm. That Jacob was sweet and helpful. But she hadn't seen that Jacob in a mighty long time. And who knew which Jacob would appear if they ever crossed paths again? She could see the barn up ahead, the ragged shape of it butting against the cloudy night sky. Her face and arms still stung. The top half of her body was swollen and painful. The nettles created rashes that stung and itched, and she shoved her hands in her pockets of her apron to keep herself from scratching the wounds until they bled. The air was humid, and though she couldn't see Zeke, she could feel him there, waiting and looming, with that crooked, unsmiling grin. She felt foolish for trying to stop the inevitable, for what was coming anyway, like a wave rising up over the shore, like rain bursting from a cloud. Some things couldn't be stopped, and wasn't she silly for still trying? She hadn't been able to stop previous times, whether the men were white or black, slave or free, whether they snatched her from behind and choked her until she suffocated, or just talked and talked and talked while they pulled her dress up over her face. And she hadn't been able to stop the country from eating Jacob, even though she tried. She stopped at the cookhouse, where a covered tray lay on the table. She picked up the tray and moved stiff-legged to the barn. She made her mind blank as a sheet as she walked into the barn's dark maw, in much the same way her father had walked into the sea. She had never been told what body of water it was, only that he charged forward into the rising water, determined to walk back home. Mother Mary, why did you not bring me a great sea to walk into? Zeke stirred when he heard her, a pine knot torch catching light, and she could see him in the dim flame, sitting up in a makeshift bed of hay, a soft expression in his eyes. "You hungry?" she said. "Starving, but I don't eat until..." "Right," she said, putting the tray down on a bench. She went and eased herself down next to the man on the pallet. "You're very pretty," he said. "Don't. Just get it over with," she said, lying down. The flame went out, and she pulled up her dress. She thought then about water, how it must feel when boats enter it, the sharp bows that seemed to sever the water in half but didn't. And she thought about Jacob, how he'd kill this man if he knew. But he would likely never know, because he didn't stay. When Peyton slipped back into the cabin sometime later, we were still up sewing. We had just finished our allotments and had taken up hers. "Go to bed. I'll finish," Junie whispered to the rest of us. We shook our heads. Patience lumbered past, and we all resisted the urge to touch her, to squeeze her arm or rub her back. "Nan brought down more salve," Junie said, her voice sounding more like a question. Patience didn't respond. She walked over to the pitcher on the table and filled a bowl with water. We finished our sewing without speaking while we listened to Patience behind us, washing the man off of her. Once she was done, she fished around her bedding, slow at first, then more frantic, tossing out the stuffing, as she had done the day before, but searching this time, her fingers pulling apart the moss and hay. She shook loose her dress, the pockets. "Where my beads?" We looked up. "My rosary beads. Nobody seen them?" We shook our heads. "You had them the other day," Sarah said. "I know, but they ain't here now." We tried to help her look, but the dark, shadowy cabin made it hard to see much. We grazed the uneven floorboards with our fingers, checked the hard wooden shoes chucked in the corner. Finally, Patience stopped. "Alice, you take them?" Alice paused, scratching her face. "Course not. 'Cause if you took them, I won't be cross. I just want them back. Now." "I said I ain't got them." Patience walked over to Alice's corner of the room, where her pallet and trunk lay. Patience put her hand on the trunk and drummed her fingers on top of it. Alice's blank expression grew steely as she rose from her stool. "Don't bother my things." "Open it then. Show me they not there. We all know you got a bad habit of taking what don't belong to you. So now I'm a thief and a liar?" "Alice, even the mice in this room know the answer to that there question." Lulu let loose a low whistle. Back home, those are fighting words. Lulu, shut it! Alice leaped toward Patience, but Junie grabbed a hold of her arm. Leave her be, Junie said with a hard edge in her voice. Let her go, Lulu said. Patience a big girl. She can answer for all them choice words she's spittin'. Lulu, stop, Sarah said quietly. No one's talking to you, bird. How about everyone shut it, Junie said. Let's not add any more dog to this awful day, all right? There was a general nodding and muttering, the tension in the room loosening a bit. Junie let go of Alice's arm with an affectionate squeeze. Patience moved back to her bed. She shoved the stuffing back inside her mattress and lay down, pulling her blanket up over her head. Even in the dim, flickering light, we could see her body shaking. Normally, one of us would go over to her and whisper soothing things, but this time, no one did. It was as if we feared the stockman's presence was contagious, and whoever touched her would inevitably be next. Chapter 4. Being past childbearing years, Nan was the only one exempt from spending a night or two with Zeke. However, she was responsible for certain hospitable tasks. It was she who showed him where to bathe, washed his clothing, and cooked his meals, serving him breakfast and lunch at the cookhouse daily. And Nan felt bad for not realizing what he was the moment she saw him. In hindsight, she felt she should have seen it. There was a certain incoherence around the eyes she noticed that first day and, even now, was still trying to make sense of. Some days he ate on the cookhouse steps, and when he'd catch her watching him, he'd give her the strangest manic grin, his lower jaw twitching from side to side. The two halves of his face didn't seem connected, deadened eyes, and an animated mouth. Ever since Patience was struck for rejecting the man, Nan had been trying to find something that would help the women's cause. Before sunrise, she crept out into the woods, searching for roots and shrubs that might be useful. She didn't want to kill him, just wanted to make him ill enough that he couldn't perform. By the time Nan reached the edge of the woods, the sun was just coming up. The dogwood trees were flowering. Small red berries glistened from their branches. She could take back some berries that might cover the bitter taste of dogwood bark. Perhaps she could even make him a dessert. In the understory, tall, spindly plants with purple leaves swayed in the faint breeze. Pokeweed. It was poisonous, but the timing was all wrong. The trick with herbs was always timing. Harvesting a plant at the wrong time could be disadvantageous, even fatal. Choosing the wrong day, the wrong moon, could do a person serious harm, and she wanted to show a bit of restraint. After all, he had a family to go back to. He told her as much, mentioned them with great care for some reason, and she thought it strange then, as she had barely exchanged more than a few words with him. "You done?" was the only thing she could remember ever saying to him, but no matter what she said or if she said anything at all, he took her presence alone as an invitation to talk. Maybe he was lonely, or just wanted this one woman to see him as whole, even if it was just the old lady cooking up victuals in a dark, smoky kitchen. The impulse was a reasonable one, she supposed, but she didn't care for it, couldn't oblige him. She just wanted him gone, with as little harm done to the women down farm as possible. There was some Jimson weed, a white flower surrounded by spiky leaves, but it seemed risky. It could sicken the man, she knew, but it was more likely to create an effect on his brain than his body, more likely to send him into some dreamy, hallucinogenic state where there'd be little telling what he'd actually do in that dark barn. Some feet ahead, she spotted a chaste tree, its bright purple flowers just beginning to open. She wandered over to it, sensing some vibration calling to her. An unbelievable phenomenon, she realized, whenever she tried to describe it, but she had known it all her life. This ability to hear plants and trees whispering to her, offering her help. Young women came to her all the time, trying to develop remedies for one ailment or another, as if healing was just a matter of putting together the right recipe. They didn't understand the most important part of her job was listening. That most plants have dueling abilities, easily able to heal or kill you, and their effect on a body could change based on the makeup of that body. It wasn't like baking a pie, she warned whoever would listen to her. She had learned this the hard way, after years of trying to ignore what her grandmother had taught her when she first began apprenticing. "The gift ain't just here," the old woman used to tell Nan, placing a palm over her eye. "It's here, too," her grandmother had said, motioning toward Nan's ears and heart. "Plants able to do most anything if you listen to 'em." Take the chaste tree, for instance. In women, the seeds were thought to aid one's fertility, but in men, the seeds acted as a sedative for their lower parts. She reached past the bright flowers, the fan of green leaves spread out, the thin reeds bearing clusters of black seeds. She took 2 seeds, crushed them with the edge of her mattock, and inhaled their sweet scent. Yup, these will do nicely. She carefully removed a few clusters of seeds and dropped them in her lap bag. The sun rose higher, and she rushed back the way she came. She paused for a long second, in front of that dogwood tree she saw earlier, as it was still whispering to her. She put her hand over it and thanked the trunk in advance for its assistance, before peeling off a few pieces of its smooth gray bark. It was another sedative, but, in the right amount, could cause nausea and painful stomach aches. Then she hurried back to the farm, a remedy already forming in her mind. She'd boil the dogwood bark for a few hours and use the liquid to make Zeke a soup. Then she'd crush the seeds and sprinkle them on top. She'd set it all with a nice piece of cornbread, just ripe for dipping. Back at the cookhouse, she got the cornbread on the flames and the dogwood tea boiling. And when she saw the women coming in for their mid-morning meal some hours later, she left them their coffee and bread without saying much. She didn't want to offer them false hope. The remedy would likely work, but it just as well might not. Bodies and medicines could be unpredictable. When Lulu's turn came, she sat down opposite Zeke and emptied her pockets. On the dirt floor, she had laid out an assortment of valuables, one by one. 2 silver shillings, a handful of seashells, a small mirror the size of a fist, a speckled barrette, 1 gold button, and a set of rosary beads. "And I got a hog, too. I ain't seen him in some time, but can find him if you want him." Zeke looked at her puzzled. "All this for me? One hand washes the other, right? They pay for a thing. I pay for the contrary," she said. "Understand?" His jaw hardened. "I understand you best get those trinkets out my sight." "I ain't mean you no offense." She held up an iridescent cone-shaped shell. "You ever seen the creatures that live in these? If I had a place this pretty, I'd never leave it." She was rambling now, her words running together as she picked up each object and explained its origin story. "This mirror belonged to my sister. She gave it to me when we parted. And this barrette, too. It's broken now, but I still keep it. Oh, and these beads." She picked up Patience's rosary beads and rolled them in her palms. "These belong to my mother. My inheritance. I'd hate to part with them, but..." The man's hard jaw softened and his eyes wandered as boredom overtook his face. He let her talk a while longer before removing the rope from his trousers and lowering his pants. She talked the entire time, now contradicting everything she said before. New linkages arising. The shillings handed down from her father when he died, the beads from an uncle, a cousin, the mirror from an old mistress who had taught Lulu her figures, the barrette a gift from her oldest brother. She had offered Zeke her entire life savings, a treasury of things lifted from all the different places and farms she had been. None of the stories were true, all the people she linked to the objects imaginary. When she first stole them, she had only intended to borrow them, but people noticed them gone before she could return them, and it became much too hard to give them back. The fact that folks missed them, wondered after them, only confirmed what she had gained by taking the items. The closeness born of the object, the gift with all that warm feeling attached. A lineage of kin, blood or otherwise, connected to it. That was the thing she wanted. That was the thing she took for herself. She wasn't willy-nilly about it. She wouldn't pocket any old thing, and to her credit, she tried to do it less and less. But there were particular times when she couldn't help it. Whenever the world felt particularly dark or more lonesome than usual, the treasure of objects made her feel better. It couldn't be helped that an object's warmth soon wore off, and she'd have to obtain something new to keep the good feeling going. And so it was with Patience's rosary. The wooden beads connected by a frayed piece of twine radiated something unfamiliar to her, the kind of connection an orphan like her had never really known. On her last farm, folks called people like her lost, a no-name, a person sold away from her family so young they were doomed to remain forever unmoored. She had been sold 4 times and she wasn't an old woman yet. In truth, though, she didn't know how old she was. Older than Sarah for sure, but younger than Junie and Patience, and likely closest in age to Alice, who believed herself to be 24 or so. To the whole of the group, she lied all the time about the friends and family she'd left behind. Aunt Carrie, who was the funniest, Cousin Brindy, who could dance better than any of the neighboring folks. A trail of names from an assortment of farms, names and faces she mixed up now and then, fading as the years passed. Because no one else need know she was a no-name. If they couldn't recognize it, she wouldn't bother telling them. People sensed it, though. even if they didn't know what it was they were sensing. The sliver of desperation was familiar as the smell of rain coming. She hunted for the telltale signs of it on her, and had only recently accepted that there was little to be done about it. She was the kind of woman people disliked immediately, without the need for evidence. An instinct of some kind that remained no matter how much wooing she did. The cachet of objects, though, never refused her. They remained perfect and arrested emblems of affection and warmth. What did it matter if that affection and warmth was originally for someone else? And so, when the man set about his work, she cast him in the same light. She placed his hands where she wanted them. She imagined them a lover's hands. She told him how much she'd missed him, reminded him how long it had been since they had last seen each other. "Don't you remember that peach tree?" she whispered in the man's ear. Now no longer Zeke, but a man she had known 2 farms ago, or a woman at an outpost near Houston. "Mm-hmm," he answered. The willful collapsing of memory never adhered to the moment perfectly. The grafting was always lopsided and ill-fitting, but if she squeezed her eyes shut and concentrated, the phantasm held up just long enough. Junie had already been working her own plan. She hadn't washed herself or changed her clothes in days, and after many hours chopping cotton under the July sun, the rank smell emitted from her intensified with every passing day. And to make matters worse, she started wearing an asafoetida bag around her neck to ward off a summer flu, she said. The smelly herb mixed with body odor was enough to give anyone a headache. The smell was so strong we slept with the window covering pulled back, the front door cracked, and the fire still going in the hearth, even though it was still unearthly warm at night. Usually, we kept the window covered and the door shut, with a chair in front of it, for fear of lobos or bears or men. But this time, we wrapped our weekly food rations tightly in a quilt and hid them underneath the floorboards. We used up half of that week's salt, drawing protective lines along the window's edge and in front of the door. Whenever we grumbled about the smell, she paid us no attention, just hitched up her trousers and retightened the rope she used as a belt, her way of letting us know she didn't care nothing about our grumbling, and it wouldn't change her mind. She was stubborn that way. The night Junie was sent up to the barn, she picked up the tray from the cookhouse and spit in it. She had to remove her cob pipe to do so, and a tiny bit of ash fell into the soup. Ah well, more flavor. With one hand she held the tray and with the other a pine knot torch. It was a moonless night and the humid darkness felt syrupy and thick. She raised her torch high as she stepped into the barn, spotting Zeke sitting in the corner. He waved her over. He appeared smaller than she remembered, a bit paler too, his forehead damp with sweat. She put the tray down near him and sat out of arm's length, but close enough for her smell to overtake him. "Ain't feeling too good," he said. She continued to smoke her pipe, eyeing him closely, stifling a laugh when his eyes filled with water, and he coughed, the smell finally reaching the back of his nostrils, the rise of his throat. He coughed again, and she cackled. "Say, gal, whose britches you got on?" he asked after a while, peering at her trousers with hazy, bleary eyes. "They mine. You like them?" "No," he said, making a puzzled face. She laughed, his confusion coupled with sickness making her feel more at ease. "They were a gift," she said. In truth, they started out as a punishment. All the women wore long skirts and dresses, no matter the season, no matter the task. In muddy weather, the hems grew black and soiled. When washing clothing at the creek, the skirts were cinched high around the thighs, but still got soaked by rising water. And Junie was no different until she and Lizzie got in one of their rows. Out in the reaches of Texas country, Lizzie was horribly lonely, and she liked to summon Junie up to the house to lollygag with her about times back home, as if they were old friends having tea. Junie hated these sessions, but she put up with them, in hopes of securing a bit of news about her children back in Georgia. Whatever affection the woman claimed to have for her, she knew she should treat it like glass, a fragile, endangered thing. But sometimes she failed miserably. The last time she did, she was too exhausted to hold her tongue and criticize Lizzie's jagged cutting of the cloth set aside for the women's winter garments. The cutting was a task Lizzie always insisted on doing herself, but since she didn't have to sew what she cut, she didn't realize how much extra work she created. Junie listened to the woman chatter on, while slyly trying to steer the scissors straight, but all she could think about was how exasperating it was going to be later, trying to make the seams lie flat and the edges not fray. Finally, she interrupted Lizzie midstream and demanded the woman hand the scissors over. "A blind mule could do better," Junie muttered. After that incident, Lizzie took her clothing and left her only Harlow's old trousers and shirt to wear. Most women wouldn't be caught dead in a pair of breeches for fear of being seen as mannish or ugly, fear some of them already had by nature of the labor they did. After all, when was the last time anyone had seen a white lady make a road or fell a tree? Ladies wore hoop skirts and bonnets. They sat in parlors away from the oppressive glare of the sun, where they sewed or spun. And maybe some of the poorer ones went out and fed the chickens or milked the cows or even churned the butter themselves. But there were certain things they would not do. And because Junie and the others washed the linens of said ladies, they knew that while their clothes and sheets may smell of flesh or musk or urine, they were hardly ever crusted with soil, mud, and the carcasses of dead bugs. All things she and the other women beat from their own clothing and linen regularly. She didn't take back what she said to Lizzie, initially out of spite, and as time went on, she grew to like the trousers and wanted to keep them. She couldn't ignore how nicely they kept her thighs from chafing in the heat, or kept the insects from attacking her ankles in the high grass. The skirt was a tent for things. What got trapped underneath often sank its teeth and claws into her flesh, but no more. The women ribbed her about wearing the white man's pants, a talisman of his power, his evil. What could it do so close to the skin? It was likely to cause her flesh to rot, they teased. Zeke moved toward his tin cup of water and drained what was left, putting it down with a loud clatter. His chin wobbled on his neck before pointing in her direction. "Did you bring me a drink?" "No." "Fetch me some water, please?" "No." She returned his puzzled gaze, but her humor was lost on him. He jolted up out of the barn and vomited, his body heaving and seizing, until finally he sat down right there in the entryway, his head leaning against the doorpost, his mouth sucking air in greedily. Junie stood up and slipped past him, so relieved she could cry. By the time she reached the cabin, she was whistling. She pushed open the door and grinned. "He down like a rabbit in a trap." Sarah and Alice looked at her puzzled. "What you mean?" said Alice. "He's sick." "How sick?" asked Sarah. Junie shrugged and stretched out on her pallet. "But won't Lucy think you did something to him?" "Doubt it. But if he do, maybe it'll put something on his mind. Make him realize this ain't the way." "He think you did something, ain't he likely to kill you?" asked Patience without raising her head. "He can't get the harvest out of the ground without me." "He know it, and I know it," said Junie, pulling off her trousers. "Besides, that traveling nigger ain't dead. I know dead when I see it, and he not it." It wasn't the first time Zeke had been poisoned. Since being sent out on this traveling business nearly 5 years ago, he'd been stabbed, burned, blinded, hexed, peed on, and called every name but a son of a god. Husbands, boyfriends, and fathers waited for him in the dead of night, and he didn't like fighting them, but when they came, he was ready. Not because he wanted to hurt them, not any more than he wanted to have sex with their women. But where else was he to put all these things thrashing about inside him? When they swung at him, he swung back harder, cracked ribs, kicked out teeth. Not because he was in the right. He knew if he was in their place, if any man touched his wife or his daughter, he'd do worse. But he had a job to do, and the quicker he did it, the quicker he could get home to his own family. He accepted that it was only a matter of time before someone killed him, before he was castrated or infected, made so sick he withered and died. And every day of every trip he went out on, he woke up wondering if that day had finally come to pass, unable to barely breathe until he returned home and hugged his wife. That wasn't always so. When he was young and foolish and unmarried, it didn't seem such a bad job then, at least in theory. He was more social then, loved going to frolics, and always had a few sweethearts on neighboring farms. And like most young men, he had a ferocious appetite for laying down with them. It seemed like the most natural thing in the world to him, not unlike eating or sleeping. But that changed when he was sent into one smelly back room or another and told to copulate with a crying, fearful woman as if he were no more than a bull or a horse. And late nights, when he gathered with the men on his home farm to drink rot gut and gamble a bit, they pressed him for lurid details about the women he met, lust gleaming in their eyes. Just once, he wanted to tell them how he hated it, how all the looks of disgust and fear began piling up inside him, how they burrowed under his flesh like a nasty parasite, how he used to love the smell of women, but the musky scent of these scared, angry strangers clung to him for days, made him sick. But he knew what the men wanted to hear from him, so he gave it to them. He boasted about all the women he bedded, how sweet the loving was, and the scores of children he gave them. He never told them how he begged his owner to stop sending him out, how he just wanted to be home with his wife, and how Master Simmons just laughed and shook his head. Knew I should have never let you marry in the first place," the old man said. "You know, Jensen was just by here, and he's taken quite a liking to your little boy. Now, I told him he wasn't for sale, but—" This was the cost of keeping his family intact, having his wife and children all under the same roof, and if he only had to travel a few times a year, maybe that was worth it. His face burned with fever, his clothes were drenched in sweat, his stomach roiled like a stormy sea. Someone had finally done it, he thought. And now he could put to rest the idea of stopping it himself. He had seen desperate men take to themselves with an axe, chopping off a finger or a foot to avoid being sent into the jaws of Cain country. It never worked. Lying never worked either. It only ratcheted up the evil. He had tried it a few times when he first started out, when the woman was so upset he couldn't bring himself to do it. And when the door was unbarred, he lied and said they had. He quickly learned it only made things worse, only created maniacal audiences, viewing parties of white men who sat alongside, tittering and ogling, clamoring and shouting like they were at a boxing match. But maybe that was all over now. He flopped over. A cloud of dust rose up, filling his nose and mouth. He coughed and lay back, opening himself to the full weight of the fever. And when the old cook came in with victuals and medicinal teas, he waved her away. Harlow then doused him with ipecac and castor oil, which made Zeke's retching worse for a spell before the fever finally broke. Once it subsided and he was finally able to stand again, he had to admit the feeling that washed over him wasn't relief. Sometime later, Mr. Lucy told Junie to take Zeke his dinner and look after him. It became clear to everyone then that they hadn't succeeded in ridding themselves of the man or his task. Sarah took to hiding out after that, disappearing into the woods for hours, sometimes a whole day, hoping she might be skipped in the process. She'd come back hungry and wan and peppered with purple inflamed pest bites. Nan would feed her and grease the wounds. But at the first opportunity, she'd disappear again. So it wasn't surprising when they put the harness on her. A strange contraption, with 2 iron bars across, one encircling the shoulders, the other the torso. The 2 crossbars were connected by a vertical iron spine that towered up over the wearer's head, where a small bell was fixed. The bell rang all day and most of the night, every time she moved and even when she didn't. She slathered wet mud inside it to make it stop, and that would help once the mud dried. But it didn't take long for the mud to dry further and flake off in large chunks, raining bits of dirt into her hair or down her dress. She wore it nearly a week before they removed it, the sudden absence of the weight making her lightheaded and nauseated. And even with it gone, she still heard the ceaseless ringing inside her, between her ears, bouncing around her chest. One night, Mr. Lucy dispensed with the dinner ritual altogether and walked her to the barn himself. He closed both barn doors and locked her inside with Zeke, the darkening sky still visible through the slats. She banged on the door until she was tired, while Zeke whittled on a bench. She slid down to the ground, her back against the door. "Water?" he said, cocking his head in the direction of a pitcher on the floor. Her throat was dry, but she couldn't bring herself to say yes to the water. It seemed like saying yes to the whole thing. He stood up and filled the cup and set it down a few feet from her. His long shadow spread toward her, and she pulled her knees up to her chest to keep the shadow from reaching her feet. He returned to his bench and continued his woodwork. "I know you hates me, and I don't mind it. I don't. But whether you hate me or not, it all comes out in the wash just the same. I can get it over with, and you never have to see my ugly mug again." She heard the wind outside knocking against the cabin walls. An inevitability of a rising storm headed toward her. Neither Patience nor Junie nor Lulu had escaped it, and they were smarter than her, wilier than her. How did she think she could sidestep this thing when they hadn't? She remembered when she and her brother Jonas were little. They were twins, her being the oldest by a few minutes. Often enough they took up trouble together, but when their misdeeds were found out and the time came to pay for their sins, oh, how different they were. Jonas would walk right up to their father and take his beating, by sticking his hand out or turning his backside to the waiting hand or tree switch. Jonas would cry when struck, but not long afterward he'd be off on his next bout of mischief, as if the earlier event had never happened, whereas she prolonged the spanking for as long as possible. She hid out for hours, sometimes a whole night, her father finding her in her favorite hiding spot. He'd pick her up and put her to bed next to her brother, but the next day, the whipping still awaited her. She'd be dragged back to the site of the alleged crime and whipped. And even though her father never hit her as hard or as many times as he hit Jonas, She cried twice as much, was twice as angry, and got spanked for still sulking about it days later. She missed her brother, but it was hard to remember him without his teasing admonishments. He'd say whatever happened was all her fault, because she made what should have lasted a few minutes go on for days. She heard Jonas in her ear now, below the faint ringing. And so, she didn't stop the man when he finally pushed her down into the hay. She closed her eyes tight and thought of Jonas on the other side of a whipping, gleefully throwing sticks in the air and watching them fall. When Alice's turn came, she had already decided. She'd go into the barn one Alice and come out a different one. She had long harbored an obsession with molting animals, snakes, grasshoppers, and frogs that shed skin, leaving their old selves behind. Whatever happened in that dark room need not touch any other parts of her life. She could find whatever was to be found in the barn and leave it there when she left it. She picked up Zeke's dinner and took it into the barn. She sat down, and when Zeke waved the tray away, she ate his until she'd had her fill. She was always hungry, and it was the first time in months she was able to eat as much as she needed, as much as she wanted. When she was done, she pulled out a small bottle of liquor she had swiped from the Lucy storehouse. She hadn't shared it with any of the women, and she didn't offer Zeke any either. She drank until she had enough, until the dark barn grew darker still. That was the last thing she remembered. Every blurry thing after became part of this flaky outer layer of skin she felt molting off her body. Every place he touched, every patch of skin that met his. It all would go, sloughing and molting away. Some of it went willingly, but some she had to help later with her fingernails, or the sharp point of a twig, or even the dull edge of a whittling knife. Afterward, we all felt at sea. Like Zeke was some strange illness we all caught and couldn't rid ourselves of. Some felt it in the body, congested lungs, rheumy eyes, and stomach pains, while others felt it in the mind, a thick brain fog, or the opposite, a compulsive, agitated spinning. Being so close to one another only made it worse, only made the grime inside pulse and spin and pitch, whereas by one's lonesome, the muck would settle and harden, without another person kicking it up all the time. Stop all that jawing. We found ourselves splintered then, unable to unstick ourselves, nor pull anyone else from the rising, tightening mire. We were incapable of that for a while. All of us except Nan, but we hated her for being spared, then hated each other for not having been. Pass me by with all that. That's how we spoke to each other then, in an exhausting state of seething, made only worse by the fact that we were stuck together, like appendages of the same hand.